Chapter 35. Marion tried not to resist as Joffrey escorted her back to her rooms. She could see his sympathetic face. She knew he was just following orders and didn't mean her any harm. He was one of the good ones who had been kind to her from the start, and they were few and far between in the castle. She needed to appreciate them. Her rooms were empty when she arrived. Lady Cluck must have been down in the kitchen helping out the chefs, or more precisely stealing all the food she could get her wings on, as she liked to do. Marion stepped into the room, wondering if she should ask Joffrey to retrieve her lady-in-waiting. They had a lot to talk about, after all. But then she supposed it could wait. She was exhausted by the ordeal and wanted nothing more than a long nap. She realized Joffrey was still hovering by the door. "What?" she asked, a little too sharply. Then she sighed. "Sorry, it's been a long day." "I know," he said, giving her a rueful look. "It's all right. He shuffled from foot to foot. "Oh, never mind. None of my business, I guess." "What is it?" she asked curiously. He shrugged. Well, I thought you should know that Robin isn't a bad fox, no matter what they say about him." She arched her brows, surprised. "You know Robin?" she asked. "I fought with him in the war," he explained. "I was young and frightened when we first arrived on foreign soil, and he was so kind to me. He took me under his wing. He taught me to shoot a bow." "He taught me too," Marion admitted. "Back when we were children. We were good friends, he and I, until we were separated when he went to war and I went to Paris." She peered at Joffrey. "So you were with him in the war?" "Till the bitter end, fighting side by side with our good King Richard." Joffrey pulled out his chest proudly. Marion frowned. "I see," she said, pacing the room. She turned back to Joffrey. "But now I'm confused." "About?" "Well, you say you served under King Richard," she said carefully, "but now you serve under Prince John. Meanwhile, Robin and some of the others who were at war are now wanted men, no longer welcome in the kingdom." She cocked her head. "Why is this? How have you managed to do what they could not?" The rhino dropped his eyes to the ground, looking embarrassed. "Well, my lady, it's a bit of a long story, you see. I have time, if you wish to tell it," Marion told him, gesturing for him to step into the room and sit down. She tried to remain calm, but her nerves were jangling. For some reason, she knew this had to be important, though she wasn't sure why. Joffrey sat down. He kicked out his feet, looking up at the ceiling. "Well, it all started the day we were traveling back from the war," he began. "A glorious journey, as you can well imagine, filled with celebration and good cheer. Everyone was thrilled to be back on English soil after all those years away. Most of all, Richard himself. I know he felt guilty for being gone for so long, and he wanted nothing more than to get back to his royal subjects at home. He kept joking about how relieved his brother would be when he saw him. The last thing he wanted was to be stuck ruling, he said." Marion wrinkled her brow. This was indeed the John she remembered from her days at the castle. He never wanted the responsibility of the crown back then. But clearly the lion had had a change of heart. She wondered if a certain snake had anything to do with that. In any case, we were not far from home, maybe half a day's journey from the castle, when he came upon a baby squirrel, lost in the woods. She was tiny and scared, sobbing that she couldn't find her way home. Richard grandly declared that he would not leave one of his own subjects out on the road, all alone, where she could be harmed or killed. She told everyone we would pause our journey to give her aid. Marion smiled. That sounded just like her uncle. "I imagine not everyone was pleased about this," she ventured, "being so close to home and all." "Indeed," the rhino agreed with a snort. "And so, in the end, Richard gave us a choice. We could stay and help him on his last quest, or press on and reach the castle that night. He was always so kind," he added mournfully, "and he knew how eager we were to see our families again." "So you just left your king?" Marion asked, trying not to sound as accusing as she felt. In exchange for your own bed? The guard looked embarrassed. You must understand. We were on English soil. We were aiding a baby squirrel, not going into battle. Of course, had I known what would happen. His voice trailed off, and he looked miserable. So what did happen? Marion pressed. She was close to something. She just knew it. I left with a group of about 10. King Richard had 10 more, including Robin, remained with him. Our group traveled all night and reached the castle around midnight. Prince John greeted us at the gate himself. We told him what Richard was doing and that he would surely be arriving soon. Did he seem excited about this? Joffrey scratched his head. He seemed a little worried, honestly. I suppose because Richard was still out there unaccounted for. Maybe he had some kind of intuition that something was about to go wrong that night. What about Sir Hiss? She asked. Did he seem nervous too? I couldn't say, milady, Joffrey replied. He didn't come out to greet us. It was late. He was probably already asleep. I myself went straight home, greeted my wife and children, and then slept in my own bed for the first time in years. He shook his head sadly. If only I had known. About Richard? Marion asked. What happened to him after you left? I can only tell you what I heard from the others who stayed with him that night. They say they found the squirrel's family, owners of a small inn called the Rose and Thorn, just off the King's Road to the north. They were overjoyed at being reunited with their child and offered to host the king and his men for the night. They would feed them and give them real beds to sleep on. It was very late at this point, and so Richard agreed. I see. And then he was killed the next day? Marion asked, after he left the inn? Joffrey frowned. No, he said, looking confused. He was killed that night at the inn. Marion stared at him in shock. What? She whispered, barely trusting herself to speak. But I thought... Her voice trailed off. She was too confused to continue. When the sheriff had told her the king was ambushed on the road, she'd assumed he meant on the actual road, not in his bed at some local inn. This changed everything. How could that be possible? She asked, her heart thudding. After all, Richard would have been behind closed doors, surrounded by his men. Why hadn't they sounded the alarm? I do not understand it myself, my lady, Joffrey replied, sadly. For Richard had 10 able knights at his side. He hung his head. Of course they're not knights anymore. Once Prince John learned what had happened to his brother, he declared every knight present a traitor to the crown for failing to protect their king. He arrested the ones he could, throwing them in his dungeons, and only a few, with the help of Robin, managed to escape. He shrugged. So, to bring it back to your original question, now you know why I am still here, and Robin and the others are not. Marion's head was spinning. Why hadn't Robin told her any of this? Had he been too ashamed to admit he'd failed her uncle? And there was another, more troubling question that nagged at her mind. While she knew Robin never would have betrayed his beloved king, she couldn't say the same for the others. Had one of them been on the scheme from the start? Or was something larger at play here? One thing was for certain. Richard's death had not been the random attack she'd been led to believe, which meant someone had a reason to want him dead. Someone who had the means to carry out the plan. Someone with something to gain from the death of a king.